Number lines are useful tools for graphing and comparing numbers, especially when those numbers are fractions. Did you know that fractions represent parts of a whole? Let's take a look at a number line that goes from 0 to 1. In between are all the fractions that are more than 0 but less than one whole. Let's divide our number line into 3 equal sections. How should we label these new marks? Well, our original segment had a length of 1, and now there are 3 parts that make up the whole. So these marks represent thirds. We have 1/3, 2/3, and 1 whole, which is the same as 3/3. Now, what if we divided our number line into 6 equal parts? These marks would represent sixths, because 6 of the segments make 1 whole. And to graph a point on the number line, we'll just find the mark that represents the fraction we're graphing and put a point on that mark. For example, this point is at 5/6. Using a number line, you can show any fraction you need by dividing the number line into the correct number of sections. Now, how does this number line help us compare fractions? As you move right on a number line, the values become larger. As you move left on a number line, the values become smaller. Let's do some example problems next. Graph 1/2 and 1/4. Which number is smaller? This number line is broken into 2 equal parts, or halves. Let's graph the fraction 1/2 by plotting a point right here. On this number line, you can see that we've labeled the fraction amounts between 0 and 1, counting by fourths. Let's graph the fraction 1/4 above its label right here. Now, in order to compare these fractions, let's put these number lines together. We can see that the fraction 1/2 is in the exact same spot as the fraction 2/4. That's because the two fractions are equivalent. Now, to determine which number is smaller, we find the fraction farthest to the left. Since 1/4 is farther to the left, 1/4 is smaller than 1/2. Let's look at another example. This time we will graph 2/5 and 2/10. Then we will write an inequality comparing the two numbers. Since this number line is labeled with tenths, let's graph 2/10 first. 2/10 is located right here. Nice. Now, where do we graph 2/5? I don't see 2/5 anywhere on the number line. To figure out where 2/5 goes, we'll need to ignore some of these marks and only focus on the ones that divide the number line into 5 equal parts. These marks are the ones that represent fifths. Starting at 0, we will label these values as 0/5, 1/5, 2/5, 3/5, 4/5, and then 5/5 is 1 whole. So here is the mark which represents 2/5. It's the same mark that represents 4/10. Now let's compare the fractions. Since 2/5 or 4/10 is farther to the right on the number line, it is the greater fraction. If we were to write an inequality statement comparing the two, we would say that 2/5 is greater than 2/10. How about we graph and compare one more set of fractions? Let's graph 3/2 and 5/3 and write an inequality comparing the two numbers. Wow, this time our number line contains values between 0 and 2. Notice that right in the middle there is a mark that represents the number 1. Now, how can we graph these points? We need to identify the marks that represent halves to find 3/2, and then we need to identify the marks that represent thirds to find 5/3. Let's mark halves on the number line first. Look for the marks that split up the space between 0 and 1 into 2 parts, and the space between 1 and 2 into 2 parts. Once we find those, we will ignore the other marks. Now we can see the number line split up into halves. 0 or 0/2, 1/2, 2/2, which is the same as 1 whole, 3/2, and 4/2, which is the same as 2 wholes. Let's plot 3/2 here. Great. Now let's find 5/3. Look for the marks that split the space between 0 and 1 into 3 equal parts, and the space between 1 and 2 into 3 equal parts. We'll ignore the other marks and look at these marks that split up the number line into thirds. We have 0 or 0/3, 1/3, 2/3, and 3/3, which is the same as 1 whole. Then we have 4/3, 5/3, and 6/3, which is the same as 2 wholes. Let's graph 5/3 here. Nice work. Now let's compare the numbers. These points are very close together, but 3/2 is farther to the left than 5/3. That means that 3/2 is less than 5/3. So our inequality would state that 3/2 is less than 5/3. Fantastic! Try using number lines to graph and compare fractions on your own.